Hey, worship team leader, real quick, we're going to get right into the devotional. But before we do, I want to let you know that I put together discussion questions for this devotional. So check it out down in the description below. You can find them there. They're free, and you should download those, print them out before you watch this video with your team so that you have something to discuss afterwards. Other than that, here's the devotional. Hey, worship team, welcome to week number 3 of this devotional, Defining Worship. Just to remind you of our ultimate goal, we are trying to define worship in a biblical way. We are trying to allow God to define worship for us. How does he do that? He does that through his word. How are we studying that word? We're looking at the Greek New Testament words that are translated worship. So far, we've covered 2 of them. Just a quick recap. We talked about sebo, which means to fear or to reverence God. And what we learned from that word is that there is a way to fear God that is not proper. So we want to make sure that our worshiping of God is rightly founded. And then last week, we talked about our second word, which was proskuneo, which means to bow down. But the principle that we learned from that is that it's not simply about the outward act of bowing down, but it must be something that starts in our hearts. Worshiping God is firstly a treasuring of God in our hearts above all other things. And that brings us to our final word for this devotional study, the last word we're going to look at that is translated as worship in the New Testament. And here's the word. It is the word latruo. Say that with me, latruo. One more time, latruo. This word is used a little bit less often than the word proskuneo. Proskuneo is used 60 times. Latruo is used 21 times. And this word means to serve God. It's appropriate to have this image in our mind of latruo as the priestly service to God. Think of the priests going about all of their duties in the temple in the Old Testament. Latruo means to serve God. So this is where we finally get to the outward acts, the doing things in service to God. And one of the times this word latruo is used is in Hebrews 9. It's used several times, so we're going to look at 3 verses here where it's used. Let's start in verse number 1. It says, "Now, even the first covenant had regulations for latrua," or this is the noun verb, but the same word essentially, latreia. "Even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness." So remember, in the Old Testament, there were priests who served God. They latruoed him by participating in the latreia, the noun form of this word, the service of God. That's how they served him in the Old Testament. But we want to see the transformation that happened with this word because we don't live in the Old Covenant. We don't live in the Old Testament times. We don't serve in the earthly temple anymore. So listen to what happened. In verse 9, "According to this arrangement," the old arrangement, "gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper," of the latreia, the person who worships. It can't perfect the conscience of the worshiper. So we could try to re-implement all of the things from the Old Testament days, and it wouldn't be enough. It's not enough. It was never enough to cleanse the conscience of the person who worships God. So here's the transformation that happens, and this is what I want us to understand about latruo now. In verse 14, "How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, how much more will that purify our conscience from dead works?" Why? To serve the living God. To latruo the living God. Did you know that Christ died so that you may latruo God? Christ literally died so that you may worship God, that you may serve God with a clean conscience. And how does that play out in a practical way? Well, let's look at another time that the word latruo is used, and it is used in Romans 12:1. This is probably familiar to you. "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, your spiritual latreia, your spiritual service to God." So now, because of the work that Christ has done, what do? We live in response to that. We serve him. We do things. We show outward acts of glorification. External acts of glorification flow out of us. That's what latruo is. So think about that in your own life. What does it look like for there to be outward acts of glorification. That's what you're going to talk about in your discussion time. So I've got some discussion questions for you to go through. And then next week, we will wrap this all up by taking all of the principles that we learned from those 3 words for worship and crafting our final biblical definition of worship. Until I see you in the next devotional video, keep leading worship well.